Okay, moving right into satellite imagery. You can see, well, first we'll start here along the southeast coast, front slowly moving eastward, and that slow eastward progression allowed it to drop a fair amount of rainfall today, especially over the southern southeast coast. Lighter amounts up to the north here with the main band already into Canada there, but rainfall amounts ranged from, about 2 inches down at Ketchikan in the last 12 hours to about an inch over at AKwx, and then lighter amounts of the North Juneau picking up about 1/4 of an inch, Sitka at about 1/2 an inch. Otherwise, some areas of light snow here along this area, clouds from the Copper River Basin up to the northwest to the western Arctic coast there, and also some light snow showers, areas of Cook Inlet down around Kenai, Soldotna, and those areas there, and also here over the southwest interior. Then this front coming eastward, spreading wind and a little bit of moisture into the southwest coast, trailing back across the Alaska Peninsula today, and peak wind gusts 60 miles an hour at St. George Island as that system came up from the east and southeast, that bringing warmer temperatures into the Pribilofs during the day today, and then not much rainfall here with that. The heaviest amount, less than 1/10 of an inch at Adak, and fairly light amounts here over the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. The main low center holding back to the west there with the front extending eastward. So this portion of the front really beginning to weaken as it pushes eastward, but it'll hold together enough to bring some moisture into the southwest coast later on, and then this trough up over the interior produce some areas of light snow, anywhere from 1/4 to maybe an inch at the most in some areas, and then tapering off to some scattered snow showers with mostly sunny skies breaking out over northern Cook Inlet and Anchorage up to Birchwood toward Eagle River today, and a little more in the way of clouds for Prince William Sound, and pretty nice conditions there in Seward. North winds gusting to about 30 miles an hour, mostly clear Kodiak Island today, and then the rain with this front, as I mentioned, heaviest over the southern panhandle. And moving to forecast for tonight, rain and snow showers likely across all the southeast coast, with a weak low remaining off the coast. Areas of light snow and snow showers possible anywhere over southern Alaska, especially with the incoming moisture with weakening front pushing into Bristol Bay. And look for periods of light snow over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta during the night tonight, up to St. Lawrence Island, maybe reaching the south coast of the Seward Peninsula. Weak low persisting up over the northern Kobuk Valley. Light snow showers or areas of light snow in this area, central interior, and maybe back to the western Arctic coast. Warmer temperatures, so rain and snow showers for the Pribilofs with basically south to north flow there. And then rain and snow in the increase again with this system moving northeastward over the western Aleutians. Main low center staying back to the west there and will begin to slowly weaken, but still about 950 millibars. It's going to keep the western Aleutians quite windy through tomorrow with rain and snow showers, and rain and snow showers will extend all the way to into the Fox Islands here. Probably mostly rain for the eastern Aleutians, and increasing chances of snow and rain for the Pribilof Islands, and then blowing snow in the increase here over the southwest interior, especially along the coast areas, Nunivak Island, some of that trying to push up into St. Lawrence Island area. Snow showers possible with mostly cloudy skies across all of southern Alaska, a little bit less in the central interior, and along that trough extending up to the Arctic coast. Another weak system again keeps it cloudy with light amounts of precipitation there for the panhandle. And moving on to Friday, a little bit stronger system now develops off the north coast, or actually just south of the eastern North Gulf Coast, Copper River Delta area. And that front will push more rain and snow into the panhandle, and maybe a little gusty on the winds along the north coast there, but northerly flow behind that should dry it out over the Kenai Peninsula, south central Alaska. Looking at pretty dry day, afternoon hours, and maybe like today here, all the way down into Kodiak Island for mostly sunny skies. Areas of snow, possible blowing and drifting snow here over the southwest interior, especially the Yukon Delta area, on up into the western part of the state, and then back around to the Seward Peninsula, but dry for the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast areas, and another system here bringing more snow into the Alaska Peninsula eastern Aleutians during the afternoon hours on Friday, and then that main low center drifting westward a little bit, continuing to weaken, and really not much of a factor except for the western Aleutians here, spreading some surges of snow showers into those areas. And looking at low temperatures for tonight, below zero here west of the Alaska Range, all the way down into Bristol Bay. Teens for Kodiak Island, and call it 5 to 15 south central Alaska. A little below zero Copper River Basin. Upper 20s and 30s for the Panhandle. Highs tomorrow, 30s to near 40 for the southeast coast. Teens for the Copper River Basin, 20 south central Alaska. Upper 30s Kodiak Island, and quite a range here, 21 from Dillingham to 31 at King Salmon, and 7 to 20 for the Kuskokwim Valley. Lows 5 below to 10 above for the west of the Alaska Range here, but milder for the Bristol Bay zone. Near freezing Kodiak, teens south central Alaska, and near zero for the Copper River Basin. About the same 20s to mid 30s for the Panhandle. Highs 30s to near 40 again for the southeast coast on Friday, and highs in the 20s to lower 30s elsewhere. And then for the northern areas, below zero again tonight. All areas all the way out to St. Lawrence Island, once again eastward to Canada, and highs tomorrow either side of zero here in the central interior, below zero to the west and to the north to the Arctic coast, followed by lows again below zero. Coldest on the north slope, and a little milder but not much, still 10 below for Safunga. Highs 5 to 15 in the central interior, cooling back to below zero for the north slope and Arctic coast. Lows tonight, upper 20s to the Pribilofs, followed by highs in the mid 30s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For flying weather Thursday morning, band of IFR here, that moisture coming up with the frontal boundary, northern Bering Sea down across the southwest interior to the Alaska Peninsula into Bristol Bay, creeping into Kodiak Island, some more IFR up here over the northwest interior with marginal VFR and some scattered IFR into the central part of the state and the southeast interior, marginal south central Alaska, and some IFR for the central Aleutians, IFR for most of the Panhandle, a little bit better out along the coast. And for the afternoon, area of lower conditions with the remnants of a trough here from the eastern North Gulf Coast right on up to the central Arctic coast. IFR eastern northern Panhandle, marginal VFR out to the west into the Gulf of Alaska. IFR slowly creeping northeastward across Kodiak Island. Big area of IFR out here over the northern and southeast Bering Sea into the southwest mountains there, Kilbrook, Auckland mountain areas, and then becoming VFR for the eastern Aleutians. Otherwise, the remainder of the Aleutian chain, mostly marginal VFR. And for Friday morning, quite a band of IFR here from the north central Bering Sea right across southern Alaska into all of the Gulf, all the Kenai Peninsula, but breaking out to VFR Kodiak Island, VFR Alaska Peninsula, central eastern Aleutians. Not too bad for the western Aleutians. Northern interior, not too bad. Some marginal VFR, especially to the northeast here over the Yukon Flats up to the central Arctic coast. And then IFR again, most of the Panhandle, a little bit better down on the south coast there, Prince of Wales Island. For the afternoon, solid IFR as that area pushes in across all the southeast coast, but improving over the Gulf of Alaska. VFR Kodiak Island spreading up into Kachemak Bay area, maybe as far north as Kenai late in the day, but marginal VFR for northern Cook Inlet with some lingering IFR in the Susitna Valley, southeastern Copper River Basin, IFR north central interior, Kobuk, Koyukuk Valleys, Yukon Flats, actually right into the Selawik Valley there, and then down across the Yukon Delta. Small band here in northern Bering Sea, pretty good here. Pribilofs to the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, all VFR, North Slope pretty good as well. And for passes, Anatuvik, VFR to marginal VFR, could go either way at times throughout the day tomorrow. Adigan, IFR to marginal VFR. And then for the day on Thursday, Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR. at times, VFR at other times, without any discernible trend. Just kind of bouncing back and forth there. Rainy, mostly marginal tomorrow. And for windy, same forecast, marginal VFR at times throughout the day on Thursday. And Isabel, I think it'll be mostly IFR there, VF marginal at other times, but no VFR. And then Mentesta, mostly marginal VFR expected for that pass. Antonita, same forecast, marginal. Portage, lowest conditions, eastern entrance, probably IFR there, better on the west side. And for Chilcoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels out over the Bering Sea, pushing surface almost up to St. Matthew Island, so a lot of warmer air with that southwest flow coming in, 2,000 feet up over the eastern Aleutians. Otherwise, about the surface, usual place here, Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, cutting across the northern panhandle. And looking at still some elevated icing potential here for the Prince William Sound area in across the southeast coast of the mostly light variety, and then heavier icing here with that moisture in the southwest flow and that weather front pushing possible considerable moderate rime icing into the Pribilos, but light to isolated moderate rime for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, making landfall along the southwest coast tomorrow afternoon, staying icing free over interior Alaska and the northern Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. Jet stream here showing main jet south, but coming up right across the Alaska Peninsula about 150 knots, taking a turn to the east to 130 knots in toward the southern Gulf of Alaska, then diving southeastward there off the panhandle. And at 9,000 feet, pretty light winds here for the southeast coast, stronger over in Canada. And we've got southeast winds, east-southeasterlies, or I'm sorry, west-northwesterlies at about 40 knots, south central Alaska, 60 to 80 knots over the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. Pretty light winds at 3,000 feet, mainland Alaska, the Panhandle, Gulf of Alaska as well, all the way up to the Arctic coast. Stronger winds mostly up over the Arctic Ocean there out of the east-southeast, but westerly 65 knots just south of the Pribilos, blowing across the eastern Aleutians, turns south-southeast at 50 knots. Turbulence, moderate turbulence, Alaska Peninsula, all of the Aleutians, light to isolated moderate here for the St. Lawrence Island along the southwest coast.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. A big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There are probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding, their terminus point. But at Kenai Fjords, the tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
When you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change a glacier systems, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths. It'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. When you walk down one of our trails that leads to Exit Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. There's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse-producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes, which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle, and we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Thursday, not looking too bad wind-wise for the panhandle and off the coast there. Central south coast, southwest winds 15 knots, north coast south at 15, and central southern interchannels looking at southeast breezes at about 10 knots. Seas slide 2 to 3 feet, up to 15 knots from the southeast Lynn Canal, and seas up to 8 feet for Clarence Strait. And for Friday, southeast winds 20 knots for Clarence Strait and Stevens Passage, south 15, Lynn Canal, south 15. Small craft advisories now for the south coast, out of the southwest at 25 knots, south-southeast winds 25 knots on the north coast. Prince William Sound, east winds 15 knots for the day on Thursday. Seas running about 2 feet. North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, southwest breezes at 15 knots. And variable winds for Kamishak Bay at 10 knots. And Cook Inlet, southwest to southeast winds at 10 knots with 1 to 2 foot seas. And for Friday, a little bit of an increase in the wind conditions here for Cook Inlet, southwest 15 to 20 knots, 2 to 5 foot seas, west 15 knots for Kamishak Bay, and small craft advisories for the Barren Islands, southwest 30 knots, North Gulf Coast, about the same. There, west-southwest winds 30 knots, 11 to 13 foot seas, and north winds at 25 knots, so small craft advisories in the forecast for Prince William Sound again on Friday. Light variable winds for Shelikof Strait tomorrow at 10 knots. Otherwise, Kodiak Island southwest at 15. East 25 for Bristol Bay. And southeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Friday, gale warnings for the peninsula here. Southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Strongest on the Bering Sea side of the peninsula with seas around 21 feet on both sides. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay. Southwest winds 35 knots. Southwest here 25 to 30 knots for Kodiak Island with 8 to 16 foot seas. Out over the western Aleutians, gale warnings tomorrow here. Southwest winds 35 to 40 knots, seas 20 to 25 feet. Gale warnings for Adak and Atka ahead to that front. Southeast winds 45 knots and east-southeast winds 40 to 45 knots for the eastern Aleutians with seas 12 to 24 feet. And then for Friday, south to southwest winds 25 to 40 knots for the eastern Aleutians, Adak and Atka. Call it southwest 25 to 30 knots there. And gale warning still holding out over the western Aleutians with that persistent low center there. Slowly weakening, but still giving 40 knots southwesterly gales from Kiska to Shemya. And for the southwest coast, tomorrow, east to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, southeast winds 35 knots. St. Matthew Island, east at 25. St. Lawrence Island, northeast at 25 and northeast at 20 for Norton Sound. And then on the day Friday, gale warnings for St. Lawrence Island, north winds 40 knots, turning west at 35 knots into the Yukon Delta coast. And then top end gales there for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southwesterlies of 45 knots, north winds 35 knots, gale warnings for the St. Matthew Island area. Pribilof, southwest winds 45 knots, seas 24 feet. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, north to northwest winds at 10 to 15 knots. And for the western Arctic coast, east winds at 10 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the central coast, east at 25 knots. Brisk wind advisories also for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east at 30 knots. And then lighter winds for the central coast on Friday, down to 15 knots. But brisk wind advisories continue for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, western Arctic coast, north winds at 15. And the Chukchi Sea here, north winds 25 to 30 knots. For tonight, a weak low and some light snow up over the north central interior. And areas of snow here spreading in, becoming a little more widespread over the southwest part of the state. Chance of snow showers south central Alaska, North Gulf Coast, maybe the Copper River Basin. Rain and snow showers over the Panhandle. And then for tomorrow, areas of rain and snow showers continue with this trough swinging in. Areas of light snow possible, Cook Inlet, central interior areas up to the Yukon Flats. Snow and blowing snow on the increase with this front cutting into Bristol Bay across the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Friday, low pressure drifts up toward Norton Sound. Southwest winds, snow blowing snow possible all through the western interior here from the Seward Peninsula right on down toward Togiak. Bristol Bay a break, same thing for Kodiak Island and south central Alaska. More rain and snow for the southeast coast and more rain and snow pushing in with this front up to the Fox Islands. Well, that's all I've got time for tonight. Thank you so much for joining.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.